Don't Look Up is a movie about the climate crisis that somehow does a more effective job of highlighting the problem than most news outlets do. The film's producers had an allegorical approach. They took the ecological breakdown and transformed it into a comet on a collision course with planet Earth. The early streaming numbers make Don't Look Up the second most successful film Netflix has ever made. But it's getting better reviews from scientists than from film critics, perhaps in part because at the film's core is a critique of the Fourth Estate, news outlets that have failed their audiences on an existential story. David Sirota is a journalist and political activist who co-produced the film. We'll hear from him shortly. But first, a scene from Don't Look Up and the set of a morning news show that is fictional yet somehow familiar.
Congratulations.
It's somewhere between 6 and 9 kilometers across, so
It's big.
it would damage the entire planet, not just a house, you know.
The entire planet. Okay, well, as it's damaging, will it hit this one house in particular that's right on the coast of New Jersey? It's my ex-wife's house that needed to be hit. Can we make that happen?
Are we not being clear? We're trying to tell you that the entire planet is about to be destroyed.
Okay.
Okay. Well, it's, just something we do around here. We just keep the bad news light.
David Sirota, welcome to The Listening Post. A critique of the mainstream media, just keeping it light, runs more or less throughout Don't Look Up, but from what I understand, that's kind of where the film got its start. So walk us through how the idea for Don't Look Up came about.
Sure. I was talking to Adam McKay, the filmmaker-director of the movie, after he had made the movie Vice. And I said to him, you really got to use your superpowers of filmmaking and comedy to do something about the climate crisis. And he said, yeah, I've been having trouble figuring out how to tackle that issue in a way that's not a kind of Mad Max, post-apocalyptic, dystopian kind of dark movie. He and I were lamenting about how the media doesn't really cover the climate crisis in a way that's adequate. And at one point I said, it kind of feels like there's an asteroid headed towards Earth and nobody really cares. And he said, maybe that's the movie. And of course, what you stumble on when you game that out is scientists who might have a difficult time getting the message out, getting the science out, getting the facts out inside of a media world that isn't necessarily all that interested in verifiable scientific facts.
News outlets and consumers devour stories that move quickly. The problem with climate change is it does not. Don't Look Up deals with that by effectively creating an allegory, hitting fast forward, turning climate change into a speeding comet. But journalists don't have that luxury. So what can they do?
Well, I think, first of all, climate change is accelerating in a very profound and terrifying way. So I think, actually, unfortunately, it's becoming easier and easier to cover because the effects are so intense. I also think that climate isn't just about droughts, floods, and the like. Climate change is going to be about really everything. I mean, here's the thing. The news media puts the economy at the center of its coverage. The economy is not a story. The economy is part of every story. So part of what we're talking about here is that climate has to become part of the way we tell stories in our world because it is part of the fabric of news throughout the world.
Part of Don't Look Up's appeal is that you've taken a serious subject, but the film is a comedy. Is part of the difficulty that news outlets have in engaging news audiences on the climate crisis is that the news is often so depressing?
Some kinds of climate coverage can make everything feel hopeless. And that it's just a story of gloom and doom and there's nothing really that an audience can do.
Rolling Stone just published this incredibly frightening piece titled "The Fuse Has Been Blown and the Doomsday Glacier is Coming for Us All," which, yikes.
What we need to hear also is about the efforts to stop the crisis or at least mitigate it. In a lot of ways, those can be compelling stories because in many of the stories, it's the classic story of good versus evil, private interest versus the public interest. So I don't think there's a shortage of ways to tell compelling stories about this crisis. I think there is a potentially a shortage of vision, of imagination in a news media that has gotten used to telling stories one way and no other way.
A few years back, we spoke with a climate specialist. He told us that he doesn't think governments are the primary obstacles in dealing with climate change. He thinks news outlets are. You've worked on both sides of that street, so how do you see it?
Oh boy, that's a good question. Look, I think there's not one factor here in why we haven't acted on climate. We live in a society where the way we think about an issue like climate is disproportionately dictated by whether it's political leadership or large corporate media outlets that have deep ties to the industries that are creating the crisis. Whether it is the fossil fuel industry buying politicians or the fossil fuel industry spending a huge amount of money on advertising that essentially bankrolls major corporate media outlets, that is creating a framework for the way we talk about climate change that essentially has a thumb on the scale, the fossil fuel thumb on the scale. And I think what we need to do as human beings is realize that we're going to need to actually make real changes in our energy system, in our food system, in our environmental policies, and that when politicians or media elites say that making those changes is unrealistic, or they eye roll, or they sigh, those are the people who are the problem.
Your film has been such a hit with audiences, but a lot of the reviews in the mainstream news media have been quite negative. Now, you took a run at the media in Don't Look Up. Do you think this is a case of sour grapes? Were you surprised at all?
That didn't surprise me at all. And it didn't surprise me because, look, this is a movie about political issues. And when you make something as big as this movie is, on as big a platform as it is, you're going to get a passionate response. Some people are not going to want to hear the message. I will also say that I think in the political space, some very powerful people have watched this movie and probably it makes them uncomfortable.
You cannot go around saying to people that there's 100% chance that they're going to die. You know, it's just nuts.
This is a movie that is attempting to say to millions, hundreds of millions of regular people in the world that we have a serious problem that the people at the top are creating.
Having been preoccupied with climate change, first as a journalist, then having co-produced a film about it, do you emerge from this process more or less hopeful about the future of the planet?
I mean, look, there have been times since this movie came out that I have felt pretty down, that in some ways I've felt like in the highest reaches of the media and politics, that this movie has prompted people to performatively behave as if they are in the movie itself. In other words, that the movie has held up a mirror to political and media elites and hasn't necessarily prompted a reevaluation or new behaviors or even contemplation. Then again, the huge audience response to the movie is entirely inspiring. Clearly, there is a demand for us to start talking about real truths. And there's that scene in the movie that I think about a lot. It's in that rant with Leonardo DiCaprio, and he says,
"What have we done to ourselves? How do we fix it? We should have deflected this comment when we had the fucking chance, but we didn't do it."
And to me, that's a very hopeful message, because this movie isn't prophecy or destiny, it's cautionary. And you have a character in the movie basically saying, there is a way for us to have dealt with this. And so my hope is that this is not a flash in the pan, that the success of this movie will actually be a longer lasting legacy that provides opportunities for more climate coverage in the media, and provides more of a critical thinking process among millions and millions of people in how they demand real action from their governments and from their communities.
David Sirota, congratulations for making a Hollywood film that succeeds where mainstream media so often fails. And thanks for speaking to us here at the Listening Post today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.